order. The hearing is now resumed.
Mr. Harvey?
Yes. Commissioner, it's no small task to condense 125 days of evidence into 1 hour, so I'm going to jump right in. I have prepared a booklet of the exhibit excerpts that Mr. Lund has an extra copy there. And I have extra copies here if anyone else would like to. My goal and my client's goal, Mr. Commissioner, in this commission is in fulfilling the purpose, which is reflected in the terms of reference. So I'd like to start, Mr. Lund, with the page 1 of my booklet, which is the terms of reference, and to note, and I've highlighted some of the passages there in the preamble. Preamble recites that the decline of the sockeye salmon stocks in the Fraser has necessitated the closure of the fishery for the 3rd successive year. That emphasizes what brought this commission into being. The decline has been attributed to the interplay of a wide range of factors, and you've heard much about that, including, and then they're listed. Then it says, whereas the government of Canada wishes to take all feasible steps to identify the reasons for the decline, and then carries on, and you are charged with making, you're directed in paragraphs 1A, B, and C. And C in particular, I emphasize, to investigate and make independent findings of fact. In other words, they're to be your findings of fact. One as to the causes of the decline. Then over the page, to develop recommendations for improving future sustainability of the sockeye salmon fishery in the Fraser River, including changes to policies, etc., in relation to the management of the fishery. So, Mr. Commissioner, you're expected to do really 3 things. You're expected to look beyond the range of factors that the decline has been attributed to. You're expected to identify the reasons for the decline. And you're expected to develop recommendations for the future sustainability of the fishery. And the first point I take from this is that your focus is intended to be on sustaining the fishery, not the fish. Harvesting, not preserving the fish, is the point of the exercise. And therefore the focus of my submission is on the concept of maximum sustainable yield, MSY, which goes right through my submissions. Because that's the focus of your mandate as I interpret it, and I hope what I say may be of some assistance in fulfilling that. The problem, Mr. Lund, this is Exhibit 573A, page 6. And sorry, this is a page which I haven't got in my booklet. It's page 6 from 573A. And it, oh, I'm sorry, it's not a graph number 6, it's page number 6, which is graphs 9 and 10, I think. Yes, that page. This page illustrates the problem, Mr. Commissioner. It's on the screen. It shows the total returns in the top graph increasing. There's a problem, obviously, after the 1958 run, which I'll touch upon. And then the runs are gradually built up, as Mr. Eisvik demonstrated, to 92 levels. And then they've been dropping ever since until the 2010 level. But if we look carefully, maybe Mr. Lund could highlight at the bottom part of this page, what you see in the I'm sorry, Mr. Commissioner, this is on the screen and not in my booklet. It should be in my booklet because this page 6 of Exhibit 573A is an important page. The upper left-hand graph shows the total return index, peaking 92, 93, and then dropping. And that's the problem. The percentage of run harvested is the upper right-hand graph, and that's the problem to the fishery. The bottom left-hand graph illustrates the problem in management in my submission, because you can see the escapement levels going up to 92, and I say that's what, by the essential laws of biology, has caused the decline. But the escapement levels are held up. They're increased until 2000, in the early 2000s, and then they stop dropping. 2005, they're still above historic averages. 2005 is the year that led to the disastrous 2009 run. So the escapement levels are still above historic averages. It's not until 2006 that escapement levels return to historic averages. And that's an essential.
Where's this page from, sir?
It's 573A, Exhibit 573A, page 6. It should be in the booklet because I've got other graphs from the same presentation.
Right. Thank you.
That is the Pacific Salmon Commission workshop. It's Mike LaPointe's slides from he's from the Salmon Commission. So just to outline where I'm going, I'll deal only with 2 points in these oral submissions, both relating to the MSY concept. The first relates to the constitutional and statutory framework, and I say that should cause DFO to focus on use rather than conservation per se. And I should say that throughout these submissions I'll be making the point that the DFO has lost its vision. It's become an aimless department of government. Insofar it has a vision or primary goal at all, it is conservation of biodiversity of fish rather than sustaining the fishery for the benefit of Canadians. And I say that's inconsistent with the statutory mandate. Second main point I'll deal with is biology, and I will say that it requires some understanding on your part of the basic biological attributes of sockeye to understand what went wrong since DFO took over from the old Salmon Fisheries Commission and what action is urgently required to restore the fishery. The constitutional and statutory mandate is covered in starting at paragraph 4 of my written submissions, which I won't turn to now. I say this provides the lens through which the Commission should review and assess the work of DFO. The DFO is not a federal Department of Parks. Nor is it the equivalent to the Department of Trade and Industry, but it's closer to trade and industry, I say, than it is to parks. The best analogy, perhaps, would be with the Provincial Department of Forestry, because forests are similarly a renewable resource. Conservation of forests is an important component of the mandate of the Department of Forestry, but it's not an end in itself. Sustainable use is the end or the goal of the Department of Forests, and so it should be for fisheries. Conservation, of course, is relevant to the sustainable part of that equation, but it's the use of the forests and equally the fisheries by humans and the contribution to the GDP of BC and Canada that's the primary consideration. And Canada responds to these submissions by referring to, among other things, what the Supreme Court of Canada said in Como Seafoods. I'll read it. The Minister's duties to manage, conserve, and develop the fishery on behalf of all Canadians in the public interest. But Mr. Commissioner, the words are conserve and develop. which is totally different than conserve or develop. One gives DFO the option of conserving fish and ignoring the fishery, and the other doesn't. I say that DFO does not have the option of putting conservation per se ahead of sustainable use. Canada further quotes from the preamble to the Oceans Act. It says that Canada holds that conservation is of fundamental importance to maintaining biological diversity and productivity in the marine environment. Well, again, the wording is biological diversity and productivity, not or. Mr. Commissioner, this is not just quibbling with words. It's an important distinction. In nature, survival of the fittest rules, in the Darwinian theory, and as we get into, if we are, an area of dramatic climate changes, stronger stocks in the Darwinian sense will have a better chance than weaker stocks. And the evidence before this commission gives some indication of what are the stronger stocks and what are the weaker stocks. But some witnesses have suggested we should be propping up the weaker stocks. They must be protected regardless of cost, because their biological diversity may somehow save the fishery in the future. Well, I say that's totally unrealistic. The cultist sockeye will never replace the Quesnel, Shuswap, or Chilko CUs. Sockeye simply can't be moved around the province. We know that because of their genetic makeup. And we must remember then to have approach this question with pragmatism and perspective. And I say that DFO appears to have lost that. I'm all for the precautionary approach, but if someone suggests that we should sacrifice hundreds of millions of dollars of GDP every year for 100 years to guard against the eventuality that we may need weak stocks to restock the Fraser fishery in 100 years' time, I say that's a preposterous suggestion. And Mr. Leadham says that I'm suggesting that sustainability can be achieved without conservation. And that's not what I'm suggesting. Sustainability obviously has to have due regard for conservation. Sustainable use has to have due regard for conservation. What I say is that sustainable use cannot be achieved by focusing on conservation rather than use or yield. I say that the statutory mandate requires DFO to focus on yield and on conservation insofar as it is supportive of use. So conservation is a supportive goal rather than a goal in itself. It's not the decline of genetic diversity that led to this commission. It's the decline of the fishery. Mr. Leadham refers to various references in the Fisheries Act to fish, but he overlooks the constitutional context. He suggests that the Court of Appeal decision in McMillan-Bloedel was obiter, and he prefers lower court decisions from other jurisdictions. But those decisions all affirm, and I'll quote one of the standard phrases, that the federal power in relation to fisheries is concerned with the protection and preservation of fisheries as a public resource. Not one of the cases says that the preservation of fish without any link to actual or potential fisheries is within federal power. If that were so, the goldfish in my goldfish bowl at home would be subject to federal jurisdiction because they're fish. But there's no link between those fish and the fisheries. So they are simply outside federal jurisdiction, and they're within provincial jurisdiction under the Wildlife Act, as are probably most of the exotic fish species in the aquarium. So it's not fish that is the constitutional and statutory focus, it's fisheries. At paragraph 16 of my written materials, my written submissions, I refer to another important statute. I don't think it's necessary to bring it up on the screen, but the statute is the I say this in paragraph 16, the human-centric purpose of the Fisheries Act is further supported by amendments in 95 to the Auditor General Act that required departments and agencies, including DFO, to develop their own sustainable development strategies. This led in 2008 to the passage of the Federal Sustainable Development Act, creation of Sustainable Development Office, and strategy, all of which require DFO, and I quote from the strategy, to deliver an integrated fisheries program that is credible, science-based, affordable, effective, and contributes to the sustainable wealth for Canadians. Now that is an important statute. It's been ignored by Canada and by all the other participants as far as I can see, and it encapsulates what should be the true focus under the Fisheries Act, and it's a governing strategy developed under a different statute. There are similar principles set out in the treaty. Both I deal with the two treaties, the United Nations Fisheries Agreement. This is paragraph 25 of my submissions. I'm sorry, 23 of my submissions is the UNFA. It incorporates the principle of sustainability and optimum utilization. Page 25, I turn to the Pacific Salmon Treaty, and it similarly deals with optimum production. You can see under Principles, Article 3, this is, with respect to stock subject to this treaty, each party shall conduct its fisheries and its salmon enhancement programs so as to A, prevent overfishing and provide for optimum production. The following page I set out another section of the treaty regarding implementation of Article 3, paragraph 1b. The principal goals of the treaty are to enable both countries through better conservation and enhancement to increase production. That's the focus of the treaty, the Salmon Treaty, as it is of the United Nations Treaty. A final point on optimum production that I'd like to make is this. Both Canada and BC support the notion that Canada should share its management responsibilities with stakeholders. I say, Mr. Commissioner, that this is a dangerous notion. It's contrary to the sovereign constitutional authority of DFO, and that responsibility cannot be shucked off or abdicated. I like the word abdicated. That's a term that John Fraser likes to use, and he used it in his 1995 report. The responsibility rests with DFO. That's a sovereign constitutional responsibility. It's all very well to take soundings of the views of stakeholders, but DFO is responsible and accountable for what it does. It's no good for managers to inform the minister that any given decision is acceptable because stakeholders, or some stakeholders, agree with it. My clients view this process as a means of avoiding responsibility and accountability by DFO. It's not just prejudicial to minority groups. It's an abdication of responsibility and accountability. The evidence you've heard, Mr. Commissioner, indicates that the reason why most stakeholders support consultation is because they distrust DFO, and there seems to be good grounds for that. But in my recommendations, I propose another means of ensuring trust, and that's an audit procedure or an adaptive management retrospective process, whereby someone in the Auditor General's Department will do a review and report to Parliament or the Cabinet each year on the question whether DFO is achieving the maximum sustainable benefit to Canadians from the fishery resource. In my written submissions, I suggest the appointment of a commissioner of productivity within the Auditor General's Department. There's already a commissioner for sustainability, which covers off the conservation side. But what is not covered off anywhere, and DFO is woefully inadequate, is in dealing with socioeconomic consequences of their actions. If you look at the 2010 run, for example, and I touched upon this in the limited time I had to cross-examine the DFO panel, the final days of the hearing, there was at least $100 million worth of foregone harvest in the Shuswap run alone. And that's just foregone harvest. It doesn't take into account the density-dependent effects that are going to affect future harvests. Nobody does a retrospective analysis of that. Nobody puts in a report setting that out so the government can see what wastage is taking place here, what losses in terms of jobs and the economy, and the reasons for it. If there were some sort of an audit, DFO would have to say, well, we had to do that to protect Thompson River Coal or whatever it was, the reasons for it. All right, well, let's see what numbers you protected and how, whether some other more cost-effective means could be employed. So that's the basic thinking behind that suggestion that I made. To put this in context, Mr. Taylor asserts that DFO is a science-based department. I say that's completely contrary to the evidence. DFO is not a science-based department at all. They're a policy-based department. They spend far more time on policies, writing memos, than they do on science. If it were science-based, their scientists would have a much higher stature in the department. They'd be up there in the pantheon of the gods at DFO. People like Jeremy Hume would be directing harvest strategies, like the 4 senior biologists in Alaska do with respect to the Bristol Bay fishery. I don't know if you know that Jeremy Hume's the brother of Gavin Hume. A cynic might say the legal profession holds up better prospects for good lawyers than the DFO does for good scientists. I'm not suggesting that, but I am suggesting that it can't be said that DFO is a science-based department. The scientists do not direct harvest strategies. The policymakers do, and it's based largely on consultation with uninformed persons, uninformed in the sense that they're lay people, not scientists. Mr. Commissioner, DFO, I say, suffers from a systemic dysfunctionality. And unfortunately, no recommendations by you for new policies will cure that dysfunctionality. There has to be a major change in the checks and balances that affect DFO's actions. And the only solution I can see, as I've said, is for some sort of an outside audit. John Fraser recommended that there be an audit of conservation, and that is done quite well, but there's got to be an audit of productivity. And remember, Mr. Commissioner, that jobs in the economy are said to be the first priority of Canadians. That's what the present government tells us every time they launch a new action. Jobs in the economy are the first priority, certainly, of the coastal communities in BC. But they are not the first priority of DFO, which is quite obvious from the evidence. Consider for a moment the situation of fish processors. They must be one of the few industries in the world without any assurance of supply of raw product. They can't raise their prices to their suppliers to get more product. They're completely at the mercy of DFO, as are the fishermen. And they don't have what supply-managed agricultural processors have. which is a quota-based system that assures supply. They don't have any market mechanism. They have nothing. It's amazing that they've been able to continue to run a viable business, particularly with DFO seemingly having as its lowest priority the need of the industry, fishermen, processors, and the need of people to obtain food products. So something has to be done about that. It requires, I say, a very creative and strong recommendation on your part. Mr. Commissioner, I've had a lifelong connection with the fishing industry since I got my first job in a fish plant a week after my 15th birthday in 1955. I spent some years on a scout boat with the Seine fleet, Nass, around the Charlottes, down to the Central Coast. Spent 7 years as a commercial fisherman, and then throughout my legal career, I've represented fishermen. And my greatest hope, I must say, and I echo some of the feelings that Dennis Brown articulated in his evidence. My greatest hope is that you can do something effective in this commission, and the model I look to is the MacDonald Royal Commission on the Economy. It was set up in 1982 by the Trudeau government, reported to the Mulroney government in '85. One of its recommendations related to a more market-oriented economy, and it recommended pursuing a free trade agreement with the U.S. That Royal Commission report gave impetus to the free trade debate, which I think followed after the report was issued, but it gave a strong impetus to it and allowed it to be carried through. I don't think it's unrealistic to say without that Royal Commission report we might not have NAFTA today. Now, a similar sort of thing could be done with the fishery. The fishing industry at one time was a main driver to the BC economy. The 2010 sockeye return shows us what the resource is capable of, but there has to be changes within DFO if the fishing industry is ever going to be able to, again, become a major driver. And if it does become a major driver to the BC economy, then, Mr. Commissioner, I say DFO would have earned the right to call for more budget funding. There's been a whole lot of bleating about inadequate funding, but we've forgotten that if a department can't produce tax revenue, it can't expect to receive tax funding. The department's got to earn its funding, and it's simply not doing that. Let me turn to biology, because I've only got 32 minutes left. In my paper, I deal with this in my written submission, starting at paragraph 28. I deal with general concepts about the equilibrium establishing forces that exist in nature. This section, I should say, draws heavily on this book by Walters and Martel, Fisheries Ecology and Management. It was published by the Princeton University Press. I got it on Amazon.com. I say if there are only two books that you read in the more general reading, this should be one. Roos's the Salmon Commission book on restoring Fraser sockeye should be another. And if you've got time for a third, it should be Dennis Brown's book, which recounts the anguish that the fishing industry has gone through in these years of declining fisheries. Dr. Walters, we know from his evidence and from what other witnesses have said, is a leader in the field of population dynamics. And as I said at the outset, Mr. Commissioner, you are expected to sort through the interplay of a wide range of factors, that's the way it's put in the terms of reference, and find what has caused the decline. And to do that, in my submission, you can't delegate that to the writers of the technical reports You can't delegate, I say this with respect to both you and your science advisor, you can't delegate that to your science advisor. And I have some passages in my written submission at paragraphs 112 to 114 about my concerns about the science advisor and his role in this panel. But basically, I'm saying that these are not concepts. These biological concepts are not such that someone with a legal mind cannot cut through them and determine the cause of the decline. The first point to remember in this sockeye ecosystem is this: that it always accommodated through the years of the old Fisheries Commission management humans as major predators. An equilibrium was established prior to 1985 whereby human predation accounted for around 80 to 85% of the adult recruits. It removed them from the ecosystem. Sockeye abundance was gradually increased during that period, and then starting in '87, DFO made a major change. It removed progressively the human predators from this ecosystem. It was all well-intentioned, but it had an effect just as significant as removing pike minnow predators from the cultus. But it had a different effect, and I'll come to that. I'm turning to density dependence, both simple density dependence and delayed density dependence. And I say, Mr. Commissioner, there's nothing complex about this. Everyone knows that if you spread too many carrot seeds in your garden, you're not going to get a good crop of carrots. And that model will persist every year. Some years it will be better growing season, some years a worse growing season. But too many carrots, poor crop. That is the scientific model that applies. Whether that's a law of biology, whether that's a theory of biology, or what, doesn't matter. But every scientist knows about models. Galileo and Copernicus developed models. I Googled this morning, came up with this. Galileo's work founded the modern scientific method of deducing laws to explain the results of observation and experiment. Too many carrots in the garden, too many carrot seeds in the garden, poor crop. That's observation and experiment. A model gets developed from that. The Ricker and the Larkin models are just that. Now, there are residuals. In the carrot analogy, that's poor growing season, better growing season. Peterman and Dorman got very interested in residuals. But what exactly is a residual? I say it's something interfering with the model. But residuals may be of great interest to scientists, but if you focus on the residuals, you tend to forget that they're variations. They result in variations of the model. They don't change or negate the model. If I could turn back to my collection of exhibits to page 3 of the exhibits, which is taken from exhibit 573A, it's page 10. Here you have in the top graph, you can see what the basic model does. Mike Lapointe says this in this slide: expect productivity to decline with increasing spawner abundance. That's the Ricker model. And he's got the sloping curve there. That's the Ricker model. And then you see he's got residuals. Residuals can bring it up or they can bring it down. That's what a residual residual factor is. That's what Peterman and Dormer spent a lot of time looking at. But you can't forget the basic model. The bottom slide on this page defines in the red print the residuals, trends in residuals used to examine productivity patterns remaining after removing effects related to changing spawner abundance. So it's that additional element. The next page in this booklet is page 12. And here you can see trends in productivity, the Quinnell stocks. And the trends in productivity, we know this. This was to be one of the two major stocks in 2009, and it basically collapsed. There's the declining trend line. Below that is the Ricker and Larkin models. And you can see there's very little residual effect. And Peterman confirmed this, that the Quinnell decline is basically consistent with the Larkin model, delayed density dependence. So the residual effect contribution is small. It's mostly excessive spawner abundance. Bottom of the page is the late Shuswap, and similarly, Peterman said it was both the Ricker and the Larkin model fit with the Shuswap trends in productivity, and you can see that by the straight line. There's very little residual effects. The next page, page 17, is the 2009 Sockeye forecast. You can see the breakdown. Forecast was 10.5 million, Chilco 4.2, Quinnell 3.6, others 2.7. That was the forecast. The bottom slide on this page shows the returns, hugely under the estimate. From 4 million Chilco, 270,000 return, Quinnell 3 million estimate, 2020 return. That's the problem that gave rise to this commission. Next page is page 17. I'm sorry. Yes, the next page, page 25. At the top, I refer to this page from Michael Point's slides because it's been suggested all the growing seasons or the conditions, environmental conditions, were different year to year. And you can see on the right, these are the years we're talking about. But the variations in ocean conditions were within the same range as we've always had, going back to 1960. Ocean conditions always fluctuate. And the Sockeye take that into account. There's nothing in the ocean conditions to account for the dramatic declines we've seen in Sockeye. On page 26, the slides deal with if I could start with the top slide, yes, summary of multi-year comparisons. 2008 productivity was below average, most stocks, but higher in 07, 09. And then conclusion do not show a common pattern. At the bottom of the page, the comment underscores the futility of these broad comparisons and the need for Fraser-specific indicators. So in other words, we can't look at salt water, we got to look at fresh water. Salt water is a common to all the species. Freshwater life cycle is different. That's on the next page, page 8 of this. The bottom of the page, stock-specific trends in productivity. Down the right-hand column, these are the trends. He gives the brood year that the most recent decline began, which is mostly different, one from the other. The right-hand column, percentage change. And the percentage variation is huge. The Quinnell has declined by 93%. The Harrison has increased by 140%. And there's everything else in between. And I say the only inference to draw from that is that something stock specific is driving the declines, not the shared ocean environment. The next page in my compendium of exhibits, I've got there's a similar graphic. Go down a bit, Mr. Lund. There it is in the middle of the page. This is from Technical Report 4, and again it shows the variations in ocean conditions from warm and unproductive to cool and productive going back to 1979. In other words, we've always had these features. The next page I want to refer to is deals with Exhibit 399. This is Pestle and Cass, updated methods of assessing. This, Mr. Commissioner, I think is the best simplified, the best way to understand the difference between the Ricker and the Larkin models. Ricker model is basically just deals with the effects on the generation in question, whereas the Larkin model deals with the influence of excessive spawning escapement on successive brood years. But I've got this in here because if you take time to read this, it's just about all you need to understand the difference between the two models. The next page indicates which model fits better in the different runs, and you'll see the Larkin full model fits better in Scotch, Seymour, Chilco, Quinnell, and Stalaco. The next page in this exhibit shows you what happens and how the models affect returns. This is the Quinnell run, the first page, 1948 to 2008, and you can see the spawner column, the amounts of spawners right up until 1981, less than 1 million. 85 on, they're in excess of 1 million. 2001, let's look at 2001 and 2002 more closely. 2001, 3.5 million spawners. This is where the carrying capacity is less than 1 million. 3.5 million spawners, the return 3.7 million 4 years later. See it's on the right-hand column. So basically a one-to-one recruitment. Second year, it's done again, over 3 million and 62,000 spawners, and the recruitment then drops to 640. This is the effect of delayed density dependence. Mr. Peterman said this run is consistent with delayed density dependence. This is what it does in practice. Huge loss of stocks. And then look what happens again. We've got 2005. It's still about twice the optimum. 2005, and the run. It's not written. It's not here, but if you want to write it in, I'll show you where you find this. The recruits column is 220,000. 2005. Oh, we've seen that already. 220,000 for Quinnell. 2006. The spawning escapement drops way down, 169,000. That's within the lower and upper benchmark range for that run. In other words, this is optimum. And there was as we know, a huge return in 2010. But here's something else to write in, and this is most troubling. If you want to add to this, write in 2010, the spawning escapement is in excess of 3 million. Again, nothing's been learned. It's in excess of 3 million, and it's going to be hugely detrimental again. Where you find this, this number is at page 15. Just skip ahead for a moment. where you find these numbers. Page 15 in my, Mr. Lund. These, there's the Quinnell, this is from Exhibit 1908, Selby and others, DFO workshop. The asterisk in the upper corner is the basically the this is the photosynthetic rate. This is the determination of carrying capacity, and I don't know why there are two bars in this one. The escapement in females is either 1.5 or 1.75 approximately, so it's in excess of 3 million. If you, while we're on this page, if you look down Shuswap, same thing. The asterisk shows the carrying capacity and the escapement in 2010 in excess of 3.5 million females, in other words, in excess of 7 million spawners. Hugely detrimental. There's a loss in foregone harvest, and there's going to be a huge impact in 4 years' time. The same for the Chilco. If we go back, in the interest of time, I won't deal with the Chilco, but I'll deal with the page 14. That's back one page. The late Shuswap. The late Shuswap, starting. It's interesting to start this in 1954. Spawners just over 2 million, which in the Roos book is said to be optimum, and a huge return of 15 million. In 1958, and this is discussed in the Roos book, and I've got references to it in my written submissions. There was a problem with the seine fleet, taken by surprise in some way. They weren't effective in catching as many fish as they should have in 1958. Spawners, and so what the commission did, they put an electric fence up on the Adams Run to try to stop the excess spawners getting in. And they say it was, unfortunately, it was ineffective. So they had 3.2 million spawners in 58, and led to, and you can see the recruits, 2.2 million. If we follow this down, the spawners were kept down until the huge spawning in 2002 of 5.5 million. So with a little more than 1-to-1 recruitment. In 2006, it's 2.8, but on the effective female side is 1.1 million spawners, which is almost identical to 1954. And we got a record run in 2010, 15 or 20 million. I'm not sure what it is for the Shuswap. It was a huge return. And then, if you want to write this in, about 7.1 million spawners in 2010, which is hugely in excess of historic levels. That, Mr. Commissioner, is the problem. With everything that's been done, the wild salmon policy that everyone says is the answer, the Frissies harvest scheme, all this complex management, and this is what results from it. There's a very serious problem up there that something has to be done about. Peterman and Dormer, there's a controversy over what proportion of the decline is caused by residual factors, what proportion by density. So the Peterman looked at the residuals. I've got the results of this starting at page 22. This is from Peterman and Dormer. Because undeniably there are some residual factors affecting. The top of the page is the early Stewart, and these blue lines, the blue line is Larkin, the red line is Ricker, and you see they're varying. So there are residuals in early Stewart and the Barwon. Fennell, the Ricker is the bottom of the page. The Larkin line is is flat. There are no residuals. The next page, Gates, Nadina, basically no residuals. Pitt, there are obviously residuals. Next page, Scott and Seymour, very little residual factors with respect to Larkin. Quinnell, this is page 25. Quinnell's at the bottom of the page, and this was in the body of the Peterman report. You see there's no residual effect, no residual departure from the Larkin model. But that tells you really very little, because whether there's a slight residual factor or no residual factor tells you very little. What is significant is the Larkin model itself and the Ricker model. Too many carrot seeds, too little crop. That's the scientific method that Galileo talks about. The Shuswap, I should say, page 27, a few more pages on. Shuswap, as we've heard from a number of witnesses, is consistent with both the Ricker and the Larkin model. And we would expect it to be consistent, therefore, in 2014 as well, which is a major problem that we have. So, Mr. Commissioner, this evidence, I say, fully supports Dr. Walter's conclusion, and this is that he sets out in that email, but he described more fully in his evidence, that the models explain most of the trend. Most of the loss is due to the basic model, which is due to excessive escapement. In other words, the variations the residuals, the variations due to factors other than parental abundance are minimum. And this explains also, of course, why there's a wide variation in stock-specific declines. They start at different times. They range from minus 92% to plus 140%. And it explains why the Columbia to the south and Bristol Bay to the north have had a totally different experience. If you read only one page of my written submissions, Mr. Commissioner, it should be page 21, which sets out the basic Ricker curve. Because once you understand this, you can understand quite clearly, you see quite clearly what has happened. This, and I should say, what I should have done here is written in, and perhaps you could do this on your own notes. On the bottom line is spawners. That's the horizontal line is spawners. The vertical line is recruits. As the spawners increase, there's a sharp, this is the left-hand slope of the curve, there's a sharp increase. At low spawner numbers, there's a sharp increase in recruits. The rate of increase is far greater than the norm. And then at what's called the MSY level, the angle is the same as the straight line oblique angle. Then there's the dome of the curve. That's the maximum number that's the maximum level, carrying capacity level, if you will. And then it declines down. So when spawners increase, you're into the area of diminishing returns. So anyone approaching harvest management with a business perspective take into account the law of diminishing returns, and we'll look at the levels which are recorded here. We'll look at the UMSY range, and that is meant to be the range between upper and lower benchmarks. I should say there's something else in my exhibits that, yes, my exhibit bundle, which has that range from the grant report. This is at page, starting at page 16 of my exhibit booklet. Grant et al., exhibit 1915, page 16, Mr. Lund. This page relates to Chilco, and I just have that page there for the purpose of identifying Chilco. It's the next page, which has the upper and lower benchmarks for the Chilco. 39 lower, 273 upper. And if you go 2 pages further on, you get, this is the Quesnel, upper and lower benchmarks. The 121,000, 701,000 upper benchmark for Quesnel. This is the stock that got the 3 million escapement in 2001, 2002. 2 pages further on is the Shuswap, lower Shuswap, or late Shuswap. The benchmarks there, which are set by Grant et al., 355,000 is the lower, 1.288 million is the upper benchmark. These are set at 80% of MSY, so MSY would be calculated at 1.4, 1.5 million, something like that. This is the stock that had a 7 million escapement in 2010. So this whole complex scheme, I say, is utterly useless in practice and totally detrimental. And my submissions are that the WSP should be scrapped and replaced by something simple and understandable. In the remaining few minutes, I would like to deal, well, firstly, finish this, if I could turn to page 34 of this book of exhibits. You can see at page 34 what this is what the Alaskans are doing. The Alaskans have the same precautionary approach, the same United Nations Fisheries Agreement, and this graph shows what, until 1982, there were wild increases in escapement. This is the low gray colored area, but they managed to level off the escapements pretty well starting from 1982. And look at the huge dark portion, which is the catch. That means jobs, that means economy, that means support for coastal communities, et cetera, et cetera. And the subsequent pages are from this same exhibit, Technical Report 7. They describe how the Alaskan managers go about it. They have clear goals and they apply them. And that's the model, I say, that we should be applying here as well. My conclusions are these, Mr. Commissioner. I say, firstly, back to basics. DFO should go back to basics. Facilitate fishing. Use the seine fleet as the tap to turn on and off to control escapement. Focus on stock assessment and focus on enforcement. And stop spending the majority of your budget on consultations and developing policies. Develop optimum harvest strategies based on simple functions of current stock size and the recruitment rate variables that are based on historic data. In order to determine current stock size, which is critically important, they must deploy in-season monitoring systems, test fishing if you will, but some in-season monitoring systems in the approach waters that allow managers to achieve their spawning goals and spawning goals by quickly learning about current stock size as the season proceeds. I say apply the lower benchmarks and upper benchmarks in the way the US managers do, and apply them to the 4 run timing groups, because that's the only practical way to do it. The wild salmon policy, I say, is words, words, words. It's so complex that it obscures the goal of productivity for the benefit of Canadians. Funding, I say that we first have to earn the right to receive more funds. I say with respect to terminal fisheries, and this is in paragraphs 125 on in my submissions, and I just want to, I'll leave that with you, but I'd like to explain one thing. I refer to inherently high risk of terminal fisheries. Mr. Commissioner, in the days, in my high school days, one of the things I saw was creek guards on all the little creeks around the Charlottes and places. They were guardians. They had a little hut to live in, and their sole function was to make sure that no seine boats came within the boundary of those creeks. And why that was so critically important is all it would take is one seine set close to the terminal area there to wipe out an entire stock. And so they recognized that as being inherently risky to fish in terminal areas. The same thing applies with terminal areas upstream. If we're going to go to terminal fisheries, we're going to have to greatly increase the enforcement budget. We're going to have the equivalent of the fish guardians in the old days, because all it will take is some excessive fishing in a terminal area where stocks are concentrated, that you could wipe out an entire stock. If you have excessive fishing in a mixed stock area, you're not going to wipe out a whole stock because they're mixed. They're all equally impacted. But there's an increased risk in fishing close to the terminal areas. That's one of the many arguments in my submission against terminal fishing. I mean, nobody's considered who's going to pay for the enforcement of terminal fishing areas scattered throughout the province. Terminal commercial fishing I'm talking about. In other words, fishing that has the incentive of making money. Mr. Commissioner, those are my submissions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hardy.
J.K. Lowe's, Mr. Commissioner, with Brad Caldwell for the BC Wildlife Federation and the BC Federation of Drift Fishers. I originally was allocated an hour. I donated 15 minutes of that to Ms. Baker to deal with housekeeping matters. I understand that she dealt with those with more expedition, and so with your indulgence, Mr. Commissioner, I think I'll be closer to the original than the latter. Briefly, in my oral submissions, Mr. Commissioner, what I intend to do is briefly set out the objective and structure of the written submissions, touch a little bit on the law, and not so much in the law per se, but the implications flowing from the law. Then go into my submissions on the questions before the Commission, which I break down into 3 questions really. What is the present situation? What is the past say about declines? In other words, a causation issue. And what do we do in the future? If I have a little bit of time at the end, I do want to deal with some of the replies on my submissions on the law. The written submission, Mr. Commissioner, is in 2 parts, reflecting the dual role of counsel for the participants in these proceedings. The main thrust of the submissions is essentially pursuant to my my view of what the role of a participant is. Participant isn't here to advocate a cause. Participant is here to assist you, Mr. Commissioner, in answering the questions that you've been asked. However, of course, the participant is a user group, and I am an advocate for that group, so I've divided my submission into two parts. One dealing with what I call the main issue, or the main objective, which is to assist you as a participant, and the other is to set out the specific interests and positions of the recreational fishing industry. In these oral submissions, I will simply deal with the first objective and leave the more specific one to your reading. I think I can cover this before the break, Mr. Commissioner. I would like to start with a few remarks about the law, and that's set out at pages 3 to 5 of my factum, or my submission rather. What I basically say is this, that it's essential to understand at the outset that the fishery is rights-based, and that the Government of Canada has no proprietary rights in the fishery. The implications of that are this, that because it has no proprietary interest in the fishery, Canada cannot create proprietary entitlements in others. That principle clearly places limits on the ability of Canada to create entitlements for individuals or groups of individuals. And in specific terms, Mr. Commissioner, that has implications for share-based management, and I deal with that in more specific terms at paragraphs 166 to 170 of my submission. And it has particularly strong implications for the use of fish or access to the fishery as currency for the satisfying of Aboriginal aspirations. The Larocque case says that fish cannot be used as currency by the department for paying its test fishing expenses, and similarly, the access to the fishery cannot be used as currency to satisfy the aspirations of particular user groups. I say also, Mr. Commissioner, that because they occupy the position of a steward or trustee, as distinct from a proprietor, Canada cannot abdicate its responsibility to the public by sharing its authority in such a way as to promote the interest of particular groups at the expense of others or at the expense of the public at large. And that has implications in the sense that it provides limits to Canada's ability to adopt co-management, at least co-management at the government-to-government level regimes. That, as Mr. Harvey indicated, is an abdication of Canada's responsibility to the public as a trustee of the resource. Turning specifically to the question of Aboriginal rights, Mr. Commissioner, it is my position that policy distinctions between fishing by Aboriginal Canadians and fishing by the Canadian public at large should be congruent with the judicially defined interfaces, first between Aboriginal rights and the public right, and second between Aboriginal rights and Crown sovereignty. There's a distinction to be made, Mr. Commissioner, between fishing by Aboriginal Canadians and fishing pursuant to the exercise of an Aboriginal right. And what I mean by those interfaces, Mr. Commissioner, are this. There's an interface between the public right and Aboriginal rights. That interface has been drawn by the Supreme Court of Canada, particularly in the 1996 cases. In 1996, the Supreme Court of Canada sat for 5 days. They heard 7 cases dealing with Aboriginal rights claim, 5 from British Columbia. That was Vanderpeet, NTC Smokehouse, Gladstone, Nacal, and Lewis. They issued reasons for judgment which the full court sat. There are 2 sets of dissents and a majority judgment. The decisions refer to one another, cross-reference to one another, and they really lay down the law in no uncertain terms about the interface between the public right to fish and the Aboriginal rights. And in paragraph 18, I set out a summary of what that interface looks like from the 1996 cases, which incidentally have been followed since 1996, not only by the judges who were the majority in those cases, but also by the judges who had dissented, and in particular the present Chief Justice. The principles, Mr. Commissioner, are this. Aboriginal rights exist within a legal context which recognizes the public right to fish. That's Gladstone. Aboriginal rights are additional to, not substitutional for, the public right. Every Aboriginal Canadian shares in the public right to fish with his non-Aboriginal countrymen. His Aboriginal rights, if he has any, are additional. The principle of special rights for some Canadians is an exception to the general constitutional rule of universal individual rights. That's right out of Vanderpeet. Consequently, the existence, the scope, and the protection of Aboriginal rights is to be defined and confined to the rationale for the exception. And the rationale is the integrity of Aboriginal identity. That's the constitutional value that is protected. In the words of the Supreme Court of Canada in the Vanderpeet trilogy, what's protected is Aboriginal specificity, and that is what is necessary to ground an Aboriginal right. Of course, it's trite law that the definition of an Aboriginal right is an activity which is an element of a custom, practice, or tradition which is integral to the distinctive culture. It's the core of the Aboriginal identity. It's not fishing by Aboriginal people, it is the exercise of a tradition that existed and was central to the community prior to contact and remains so. Now, with respect to the second interface, that is the interface between Aboriginal rights and Crown sovereignty, I say simply that constitutional protection for Aboriginal rights is limited to a burden of justification similar to Section 1 of the Charter. Aboriginal rights are not absolute. They may be infringed as long as the infringement is not justified. And the point of that law in these proceedings, Mr. Commissioner, is that is in paragraph 20, that neither policy, that is policy of DFO, nor an overbroad application of the constitutional duty to consult and accommodate should be allowed to usurp the judicial determination of those interfaces. The determination and the delineation of those interfaces is a matter of the application of the Constitution, and that is a judicial function. It is not a function of the policy development branch of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. Perhaps you will want to break. Before we do, Mr. Commissioner, I would just refer you to paragraph 23 of my submissions, in which I point out that two of your colleagues, the late Chief Justice Brenner and Mr. Justice McKenzie, saw fit to make comments about the expansion of Aboriginal fisheries, if I can put it that way, even where constitutional, it made comments that it wasn't necessarily good policy. And they made those comments for different reasons. Chief Justice Brenner, after upholding the constitution of the constitutionality of the pilot sales which are now the economic development fisheries, pointed out the social cost and queried whether those sales programs should be continued. And Mr. Justice McKenzie pointed out the problem of balkanization of the fisheries, which Mr. Eidsvik alluded to yesterday, and indicated that he didn't think that the pilot sales program should be expanded. I will then turn to the main thrust of my submissions. So